So hello, everyone. Welcome to Montreal in Action Education. Today, we are very, very pleased to welcome Nakuset, a friend of mine who is also the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter here in Montreal. We are on unceded territory. However, that oral presentation, or that oral pleading, if you will, is not necessarily translated into rights, into law. I want to remind people that during the public consultation on systemic racism, I asked for the City of Montreal to officially recognize in their charter that we are on unceded territory, and that recommendation was never put or never scribed in the final documentation, which means that the City of Montreal, as well as the provincial and federal governments, are always willing to say that we are an unceded territory. However, that is never translated into rights or into changes in law, and that is a problem. So without further ado, I am going to allow Nakuset and to really share not just her experiences, but more importantly, the realities of Indigenous rights in Montreal, of Indigenous peoples, and the limitations of those rights. Without further ado, Nakuset, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I'm originally from Saskatchewan. I'm Treaty 6. And I have been in Montreal since I'm 3 years old, and working now at the Native Women's Shelter for the last 21 years. So it's a long time. Because of the title of today's presentation, I was just sort of thinking about justice and the fact that we barely have any justice as Indigenous people. And there's a reason why. So what I'm going to do is, yeah, everyone can see, right, that there's like a PowerPoint up, right?
Yes.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint, and I'm going to make some sort of comments. I'm not necessarily going to read everything that you see there, but it's just for your own sort of visuals. So I have to go through history. It's not going to be pretty, but it is what it is. So here we go. All right, so colonialism. So once upon a time, this big ship came and people got off the ship, and basically everything changed from that moment on. And the thing was that originally when the settlers arrived, Indigenous people were super warm and helpful, and helped heal them and taught them how to live off the land, and introduced them to the fur trade when they decided to just basically take over and say, thank you for your help, we don't need it anymore, and now we're going to monopolize. And the reason, or the way in order to take over everything was a concerted effort between governments and churches, and creating all different kinds of policies. So if you think of, Canada being all First Nations until settlers arrived, how do you get the Indigenous people to sort of get out of the way and take over? Well, you kill the way of life. So my people, because I'm Cree from Lac La Ronge, my people from Saskatchewan, we used to chase buffalo. So one of the first things that they did was kill all the buffalo. So now we're starving. And when we're starving, it's easier to be pushed onto reservations. So we had to live on these tiny pieces of land, and most of the land was really crap. So you couldn't grow anything, you couldn't really live off it, which is why you'll have communities like Attawapiskat that, doesn't have running water, or, there's a lot of mold, or, it's very swampy in the area, so it's hard to grow anything. This was all really sort of premeditated. There was a reason why they chose these pieces of land for us. And then once we were on the reservation, we weren't actually allowed to leave the reservation. So when we talk about John A. MacDonald, he's the guy that's like, y'all are staying on the reservation and we're putting an Indian agent on the reservation and you cannot leave unless you have a pass. So when they talk about the pass system from 1885 until 1960, we had to stay on the reservation. We couldn't leave for any reason unless we had a pass, and we couldn't even go hunting or anything like that. So the government ended up having to bring in food for us. And with a lot of the reservations, they usually brought in very little food. So again, John A. MacDonald, forced starvation, this is what he did. So a lot of Indigenous people started to die, also with the disease and, you know, smallpox and blankets and that kind of stuff. So now we are dependent on the government. Now we can't do anything unless the government says so. And then in order to continue the assimilation process, then they took our children. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So when I said I'm Treaty 6, for those that don't know what that means, it means that my chief in 1876 signed an agreement with the government saying that we would get $5 a year for being an Indian. So I still get that treaty money. You think it would go up after, you know, 1876, it hasn't, it's the same. And, you know, education, so I get to, you know, go to university, that's part of the treaty. I get my teeth cleaned, I get eyeglasses, basically took everything from us, and this is all we get. It's our treaty. That $5 though, that goes to every single Indigenous person. If you remove the children and you put them into residential school, they lose that money. So it's, the whole thing is an assimilation process. So this is a picture about when I talked about how they killed all the buffalo. So you'll see there's a man standing on top and then there's a little guy on the bottom, and I bet you they are so proud of killing all the buffalo. But this led to the demise of my people. They did it to the Lakotas, they did it to all the Plains Indians. They also did this kind of slaughter to the Inuit people. They call it kimit, which is inequities for dog slaughter. So the dogs used to pull the sled so that they can go hunting. And they killed every single dog between 1959 to 1975. Every single dog. So if you have a dog and you had to tell your children that the RCMP or the Sûreté de Québec is coming to kill your dog, how do you explain that to your children? So it really had a devastating impact, and it continues to, because now the Inuit people cannot, they can't hunt. They literally have to put gas into a skidoo to go hunting at this point. But because everything now is flown up and there's no work, and if you're on social assistance, you have to look at your check and say, do I try to put gas in my skidoo to go hunting, or do I go to the corner store and buy milk for $15, right? All right, moving on. So once we're all on reservations, the government, and this is from the States, but they did the same thing here in Canada, they sold all the land to the settlers really, really cheap, you know, and they kept the idea of having Indigenous people on reservations was so that it was out of sight, out of mind. We had no idea that they were taking all our land and selling it, and that the settlers had no idea that they were doing this, you know, in spite of the Indigenous people. So then they also created the Indian Act. So this is basically a set of laws which said anything you do to make you Indigenous is illegal. So any kind of ceremony, any kind of trading. I mean, if you look up the Indian Act, and it's quite extensive, you'll see an enormous amount of information. So I'll let you do that on your own. But what was also important about the Indian Act was that they said that if we remove the children and we put them into residential school, once they graduate from residential school, they are no longer an Indian, which means that, you know, all those treaties are null and void, because you have an education Now you don't need, now you can just move into the city and we'll eventually take your land once you've all left. So I think that was what they were trying to do in 1876. So residential schools, and you can read this to yourself, right? But it shows the impact of, you know, opening residential schools. You know, there's different debates about when schools opened, but it's more or less about 200 years that residential schools were put in place. And at these schools, you weren't allowed to speak your language. You were given a new name. You didn't have any contact with your family, maybe at summer holidays, maybe not. And it was an enormous amount of abuse that happened at residential schools. So when we talk about generational trauma, this is what this is. And it's devastating, and it continues today. My mother went to residential school, right? I am intergenerationally impacted. My ex-husband's mother went to residential school as well. So our children are now doubly impacted on both sides. And I am, you know, the only one in my biological family that doesn't drink or do drugs, because I've chosen a different way of life. But a lot of our people are struggling because of what the government had done to us, and because we don't necessarily have the tools to help move forward, right? Okay, so residential school is really bad. They closed the last school in 1996, right? But the government still felt there was an Indian problem. And they wanted to figure out what the next step of assimilation is. Because again, that $5 for treaty and all the lands and all the things they have to give us because of that, they don't really want to do that, right? So now that residential schools closed down in 1996, they started in 1980 to close down, closed the last one in 1996, but was already talking about Plan B. And Plan B was the 60s Scoop. So how do we take children away now? Instead of sending them to school, what is the other option? Adoption. So let's take the kids out of the home and put them into white families. So we're going to do this either through adoption, or we're going to do this through the foster care system. So they started to do this in the late 60s, early 70s, and it continues. A lot of people think the 60s Scoop ended. It didn't end. They stopped the policies, but they continue the practices. So I'm part of the 60s Scoop. I was adopted by a Jewish family through the AIM program. A lot of the reasons why they took the children were because of the reasons that are listed. Basically, poverty was a huge thing. So they would send social workers into the community, look around and be like, well, you don't have running water, so therefore you must not be a good parent. We will take your child. Or, you know, you don't have a fridge, or whatever reason, they would take the children. And a lot of the times when they took the children, they did it in a very sneaky way. They took pictures of the children and they put them in newspapers. So this is called the AIM program, and this is how I was adopted. So they took pictures of these kids and talking about how cute and sweet they are, and you should take these kids. And a lot of these kids were in foster care, and once the parents showed interest, then they just did the sort of adoption. So when I was adopted, I was living at that time in Thompson, Manitoba, but my picture was shown to a family here in Montreal. And they liked me, so I was flown over from Manitoba. And the reason why they did these long distance adoptions was that it would be very hard for me to retrace my steps if my people are all the way out in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. So this is also another program, or the same program, but this is Montreal. So if you look at the top, you could see the Montreal Gazette and a date. So they did the exact same thing here in Montreal. Montreal, for whatever reason, is the only province in Canada where the Jewish Family Services got involved. So my picture ended up in Jewish Family Services, but I think every adoption agency throughout the country was involved. It was the new process. They literally got rid of all the other children that were not Indigenous and only had Indigenous children. So they say there's about 20,000 people that were involved, but for sure the number is higher because I don't think anyone is really taking statistics. And there was also the fact that if a social worker from Canada found a family in the United States, they got a bonus between $5,000 and $20,000 per child. So they say that if you were to empty out the amount of people that are currently like in Seattle, that is the same amount of number of Indigenous Canadians that were sent off to the States. And they are having an incredibly difficult time finding their families. All right. So the thing is that if I had lived everything that I've lived, and now that I'm, an adult, and now that I started working at the shelter 20 years ago, and now I know that currently that the women that stay at the Native Women's Shelter, that their children are currently in care, and that if we know that this practice still continues, then I have a responsibility to try to make the system better. So when I became the executive director here at the Native Women's Shelter back in 2004, I was here doing other jobs previous to that. I went to youth protection. I went to Batshaw because that's where the kids are. And a lot of the Indigenous children that are clientele, that's usually the social services that we deal with more than Centre la Jeunesse. I went to them and I explained to them that we need to help the mothers and children in youth protection, because there is a correlation. The correlation is the women that come here to the shelter, we're in youth protection, and those women now have children that are in youth protection. So it is getting larger instead of reversing. So how do we reverse it? And one of the ideas was, why don't we make like a manual, right? Sort of like you go to the store and you read that Idiot's Guide to Typing or whatever those books are. We were going to do the same thing for all the foster and adoption parents, so that when they bring up their children, they bring them up in a good way. And some of the content of the adoption manuals in front of you. So practical information on how to obtain your status, because I lost my status, but I got it back later on, and it was really difficult to find it. So how do you obtain it now? So when that child ages out of the system, it's not as hard. Resources for non-Aboriginal parents on how to retain their child's cultural pride. So all kinds of things they can do in the city. Coping mechanisms, myths about Indigenous children and stereotypes. And positive role models, right? Like Carey Price is Indigenous. A lot of people are like, he's what? Yes, he's one of us. This is a role model that we need to look towards to, instead of hearing other things, because usually in media, we often hear about Indigenous people when the 4Ds, when they're drunk, when they're demonstrating, when they're dancing, or when they're dead. That's when they usually like to report on us. But why aren't we hearing more about our leaders that are positive in the media? That's another issue. We'll do that another day. This is the cultural guide. So this is what we put together, and it's literally at youth protection. It's at Batshaw now, so that every parent that takes a non-Indigenous child, and we are overrepresented in the foster care system, each parent gets one of these, and it helps. Okay, so again, because there's a lot of injustice in the city for Indigenous people, Cabot Square is one of those places where Indigenous people are targeted on multiple levels. So targeted either for predators to go in and to take advantage of the people that have literally, gotten off the plane and arrived at Cabot Square to kind of find a familiar face. As well as a lot of police presence in that park. So it's a kind of park where there has been crime over the years. And basically, I was able to sit at a meeting to discuss with the city about how we can improve it. Their way of improving it was to take the Indigenous people and put them sort of out of sight, out of mind. They wanted to put them behind the Omer de Serre, which used to be on St. Catherine Street, in the parking lot, kind of hide them. And instead, I had to present another scenario, which is why, working with the network and the justice community, we put together a proposal and we sent it to the city. And it took literally my God, we started in 2012, and it took probably 2 years to get the city to buy into it. And basically, I was saying, don't get rid of the people. Help the people in the park. Hire someone who will work with them. Hire someone that will, be able to support them and help them and bring them from the park to wherever it is they need to be, and to sort of strengthen them. But at the same time, when they kind of revitalized Cabot Square and changed the look of it, they were afraid that the people in the sort of surrounding areas would still be afraid to go in. So how do you change that? And my idea for that was to have better or more cultural activities that happen in the park and engage the community in that. So this is what I've been doing at Cabot Square since basically 2013. So this is a picture of David Crane. That's the guy with the hat on. He is our outreach worker. He went to residential school. So he is Soto. He is literally at the park or around the park all the time. The girl in the white is Sarah. She's from Gittigan ZB. She was our summer student for a couple of years. And the woman in the middle is Connie. Not too long ago, my goodness, there was probably about 8 deaths at Cabot Square after the open door left. Connie was one of those women that passed away. So I always get really sad when I see her face, because I'm really trying to make good things at Cabot Square, but it's a process. We also started to do Aboriginal Fridays, right? So at the park, we wanted the community to come into the park and to feel, to learn about the beauty of the culture. So, this is sort of an older pamphlet or like information thing that we would give out to all the community and to all the businesses and to everyone. But these are the kind of things that were free activities where people could sit down and learn about the culture and have an appreciation for it. One of the most important ones that we did was the soapstone sculptures, and we usually have about 3 or 4 different sculptors. Now the thing is that the sculptors that are doing this are homeless, but the population that's sitting down with them and doing these workshops have zero idea. All they know is that they're learning something from the facilitators. They're learning about their culture, they're having a conversation, and these sculptors are now very well known, and they're getting a lot of different projects on the side. They're being hired through other people. We even had Rosanna Deerchild, who has a show called Unreserved on CBC, that came down and interviewed these guys. So these guys are like superstars now, and this is how we try to change the look of Indigenous people, instead of looking at them on the street as being sort of, a deterrent or an irritant, as the police like to call us, as someone that is, really showing the culture and changing the point of view of people. We usually have, this year is the first year we didn't have Aboriginal Day, but I also have a really gigantic concert that I asked the city for money for. This is Munti Sinkwa, who comes all the way from Arizona, just with his sons, he's a world-class hoop dancer. And I think that when people see the beauty of our culture, again, it changes their perception. So it's sort of something that is ongoing that you have to keep doing. These are the Buffalo Hat Singers. They're an urban Indigenous drum group. And then we also have something like with Inuit Games. So we have all different types of games that we put on for, usually Nunavut Day is the second week of July. Sorry, let me just look. July 5th is Nunavut Day, so it's coming up. So we usually have a celebration there. So what's interesting about this picture is you see there's 2 police officers in the back, right? So now we're going to talk about the police. The guy in the red hat is Carlo De Angelis. For some reason, the SPVM decided that they should have an Italian guy be in charge of the police, that he is the Aboriginal liaison officer. I'm not really pleased with that decision. I think that we should have an Indigenous person be a police officer for Indigenous people. The guy who is smiling next to him is Forrest. forget his last name. He is actually Indigenous from Saskatchewan. He was working for the RCMP. He's no longer working for the RCMP. Since that picture was taken, he's changed jobs, and I completely understand why. But you know, if he would have applied for the Aboriginal liaison officer, I would have been thrilled. We would have had someone who truly understands who we are, where we have walked, the effects of colonialism, right? I mean, I met Forrest's mother. You know, she went to residential school. He would have been perfect, but the police force is just too hard to work in as a person of color, so he's out. Carlo, though, is still in. All right. So the thing is that, you know, for Montreal, I was able to start to sign an agreement with the police. And we know that there has been a lot of tension between the police and the Indigenous communities since colonialism. The first job the RCMP had was to take the children from their parents and force them to residential school. And the parents were put in jail if they didn't let their kids go to these schools. So we have a history of tension between Indigenous people and the police. But we also know that for missing and murdered, that when families went to the police and filed complaints, that they were not taken seriously at all. And we saw this obviously with, you know, what happened in BC with, I'm sorry, the pig farmer, forgot his name. Anyways, it'll come back to me. So what I ended up doing in 2015 was deciding to have a collaboration agreement with the SPVM so that we would try to have a better working relationship because it was so bad. You know, and in the beginning, you know, it was part of a network initiative, and we were able to draft an agreement with, you know, the people involved. And within 6 months, I was really surprised that they said yes. So in 2015, I signed the agreement with the police, and I really thought it was going to be fabulous, that everything was going to work out so well. It did not at all. This is the actual agreement that I signed, blah, 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 blah. Okay, basically what the agreement says is that we're going to have cultural training for all the police officers, that we're going to have a procedure on missing and murdered, we're going to have prevention plans for urban Aboriginals, and we're going to have a comité vigé autochtone, right? So basically the committee would be Indigenous people that sit around, have a conversation with the police and let them know what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. Well, pretty much all of that went up, like, it did not go well. First off, the cultural training. So it took 2015 is when we started it. When we finally got the training happening, it was in 2018. The reason why is because every time we presented an idea, they threw it down. So this is Vicky Baldo, who's smiling. She's an Indigenous member of the community, and we created this really lovely Indigenous cultural awareness guide that had lots of information, that had events like topics of discussion, role playing. It was really well done. And we had Dr. Elizabeth Fast, who's Métis. We had Stefan Pushkash, who's Inuk, Vicky Baldo, Rachel, that helped put all of the content together. And it took us quite a long time, and it took us money to do it. And they said, no, fine, we'll do something else. This is basically the content of what is in that guide that you just saw. So then we're like, all right, the police are like, we want to do something interactive. I'm like, okay, so this is what we were going to do. This is literally what we did. We had a Mohawk elder from Gunawage who came and spoke. He's absolutely amazing. And again, his name is escaping me right now, but he is, ask me later, I'll find his name. He is the best speaker. And if anyone ever needs a speaker, he's the guy. But he spoke in English, which eventually pissed off the police. We also had some, you know, talking about, you know, stereotypes and maps, communities, cultural safety for 20 minutes. We did the blanket exercise, which is very powerful. Then we also had a break. We had some best practices. We had someone from Quebec Native Women do violence against Indigenous women. We had some legal aspects, and we even had the peacekeepers that came and did a presentation in French. We found 2 peacekeepers from Grenouage that spoke French. They came in. We had someone who went to residential school came in and talk about his experience. So we did this, and this is actually pictures of where we did it. We did it in a church. There's Carlo and with the one of the peacekeepers, and this is the group that did the training. So we had a lot of volunteers that came, you know, a lot of community members that came to help facilitate. So we did this, and they scrapped it the next day. They said, no, we didn't like it. We did evaluations. Nobody liked it. And then they stopped the training for a very, very long time. We already saw this one. So it was really, really discouraging. The thing is that if I am signing an agreement saying that you guys are going to, you know, do a training and that you were going to do something on missing and murdered, they're going to have to take it a lot more seriously. So when it came to missing and murdered, I was a lot more forceful in my sort of application to make sure that they honored this. So when I spoke to the police and started to try to create an action plan on missing and murdered, the only way to do that was to create a new program. Because if community members are still afraid to call the police because you know, a family member went missing, how is having a procedure going to help unless we have someone who works in between? So what we decided to do was create this new procedure where we hire someone as a coordinator who works in between the police and who works in between the community. So what was supposed to happen was this poster, Ishkwe, by the way, means a woman in Cree. What we did was we put this poster at every single police station so that when a woman comes in and sees it, she knows that she could call the number on this poster instead of calling 911 and speaking to a police officer. And that way, the woman who has this position right now is Jessica. She can work in between the police and the community. And sometimes there's a language barrier. So people that speak English, you call 911 who only speak French, or to do a police report that is only in French, that Jessica can sit in between and do all the translation, as well as, you know, to help the family in terms of support services. And she literally, as soon as a person goes missing, she is on the case, and she goes from, you know, the beginning all the way until hopefully that person is found, right? Or the latter. So, but there's a lot of issues, right? Nothing is ever smooth. So even though we signed an agreement, even though we said we were going to be working with the police, and let me tell you, in order to get the Ishkwe project going, because when we presented the idea to the SPVM and said this is the only solution to make it happen, they said, well, that's very nice, but we're not going to pay for it. I'm like, whatever, buddies, I will find the money. So I first found money through Justice Canada, and I got funding for 3 years to have the Ishkwe project. Then I went back to the SPVM and said, I have the money, let's move it forward. So after 3 years, the money has run out. And just recently, I called Justice Canada and said, will you renew us? And they said, well, we don't know. And the reason why they didn't know was because now that the inquiry for missing and murdered is over, perhaps missing and murdered isn't on their radar. They didn't know whether or not that would be a priority for Justice Canada. So they just kind of put us on the maybe list. But that's not good for me. I need to know that this is a service that will continue. So I went to a private foundation and I got funding from them for 3 years. And then Justice Canada called and they're like, oh, wait a minute, we've decided to renew you. So now I have double the funding, which means I got 2 staff now. So now I have a new girl named Jessica. Sorry, I have Jessica that's already the coordinator, and I have Janice, who is the research coordinator. So what she's going to be doing is going to every single community. Okay, there's 52 communities in Quebec. She's going to try to go to at least 30 of the communities and get statistics on missing and murdered, because we know what happens sort of, out west, but we don't know what happens out here. So she's going to be going to communities and getting that data and having conversations, which are incredibly painful. And she'll also be helping Jessica in her job part of the time. Okay, so now that I have an agreement with the police, they're not following up on it, which is really discouraging. There's still a lot of mistrust, and there is still racial profiling. So I literally have to have meetings with the police often. And we went to go meet them almost 2 years ago in September, because it was really not working out well. They were not helping the project move forward. They were putting obstacles all over the place. So I had to go and meet with them. So what we did, and this is all in French, was we made a new agreement about how we were going to work together. So this is like 2 pages long. And you'll see that we have Carlos and we have, Jessica's number somewhere in here. So basically, I had met them in September. When I met them with Vivian Michel from Quebec Native Women and different women leaders in the community. And we also had Ghislaine Picard, who is the sort of the chief for the AFNQL, come in, and we all sat on one side with the police and said, you need to work with us and we need to have a better working relationship. And this is what they agreed to do. But it took them 9 months from that time to actually put it in their computers. So there still is definitely a lapse, right? If the SPVM really wants to work with us, why isn't this being distributed globally? Why isn't Jessica's information being distributed globally? And even Carlo, the Aboriginal liaison officer, a lot of the SPVM doesn't even know who he is or his mandate or how to get in touch with him. This is what I've learned just working in the field. So the thing is that, for missing and murdered, there's 231 calls to justice, right? And this came out last year. And Trudeau was supposed to have an action plan as of last month, but now he's delayed it. And he's saying he's going to put it off for a year. And this is really sort of concern, but it unfortunately is normalized because we are used to this kind of behavior. And this is why I create programs like the Cabot Square project, like Resilience Montreal, like the Ishkwe project, because I can't wait for the government to implement these. If you look at the report, you will also find that there is one specific to Quebec where there are recommendations. And I am I've never actually read it, but I'm quoted in it because I testified at Missing and Murdered. And I think that when we talk about how can Canadians implement these calls to justice, it's really hard to read the 231. It is. Read the Quebec one. At least look at that. Look at what is going on here. At the same time, there's also the Viens Commission. They came out with a report on discrimination against Indigenous people here in Quebec. He had 141 recommendations. Again, they are being ignored. So that's something that you could look at and see, if you have any capacity to push it forward. Because at the end of the day, it's up to the institutions to implement them. It's up to, the mayor to implement it. It's up to the mayor works with the police, then she should be doing something about it. And, for the work that I do, there was an incident that happened at Cabot Square on May 3rd, where an Indigenous woman was in serious mental health crisis. And what the police did was, what the 911 operator did was, instead of sending an ambulance, which is what was requested, they sent 13 police officers and a canine unit. And that was really destructive and embarrassing. And only because we had witnesses, we had David Chapman who was there, and he had to intervene between the police and the Cree woman. And I wrote up a letter and sent it out to the mayor and to the police and to a whole bunch of other people, explaining exactly what happened and what we need in return. So we didn't get any kind of input. Therefore, the AFNQL, Quebec Native Women and I, put out a press release in the beginning of June, which was again ignored. So then we sent out an open letter to Mark Miller, which was ignored again. So we're just always ignored. But at least the good news is that I have a potential meeting with the mayor on July 20th so that we can discuss the way that, you know, Indigenous people are treated in Montreal. We're supposed to be, you know, the city of reconciliation. I'm not really seeing it. We're supposed to, you know, address the racial profiling against Indigenous women, and we are 18 times more likely to be racial profiled. We need to have a plan of action, and we need to know that when we have to call an ambulance, that an ambulance comes. Because otherwise, I'm just advising people to, you know, take a taxi and go straight to the hospital, because I can't guarantee that you're not going to get a canine unit, and that is really sad. All right. So my last slide really is pretty sad. This woman here lives in her community, only speaks Inuktitut, had an intervention with the Sûreté de Quebec where they ran her over with a car. She came to Montreal because she needed some rehabilitation because of her injuries. When she came to Montreal, the police were summoned to her room because she was being I don't know, she was being loud or something along that lines, and they put her into a sort of a drunk tank for a couple of hours, and then they opened the door, gave her a bus ticket, and said, go. So she doesn't speak English, she doesn't speak French, she doesn't know where she is in Montreal, and she gets lost in the system. And what is so ironic is that I get a call from Carlo saying, I think she went missing. I think her boyfriend did it. When we found out later on that it was the police who let her go and that she was lost for almost a week until she was found. So it was completely on the police. Now, the thing is that if I signed an agreement in 2015 and this is happening 3 years later, how come that police didn't get the training? How come they don't know Carlo? And why would they let this woman out? She had a catheter in her arm. Why wouldn't they just call the ambulance and bring her back to the hospital, right? And sitting on that committee for the SPVM, they have not ever shared with us what happened. We are waiting 2 years now to find out what happened. How are you fixing it? Did you apologize to this woman? What has she learned about the police? Well, she's learned that if she's in her community, she's going to get run over. And if she's in Montreal, they're going to let her loose without actually helping her. So it's really, really damaging. And unless we see it, it goes unnoticed. I'm done. That's it. That's all I got. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. How did I do for time? Oh, I did pretty good. I said 45 minutes. So that was about it. All right.
So yeah,
Thank you for listening.
We will open up to questions. If you have a question, if you can raise your hand electronically, or if you do have your video on and I can spot you, we are, you know, almost 50 people here. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand also just with your hand and your video. Or if you like, you can type your question as well. Well, I guess I'll start by the first question. You're meeting the mayor on the 20th to look at, you know, possibly the public hospital.
Sorry, what happened? Okay, wait, okay. Your last window is closed. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, we no longer see the PowerPoint, but that's fine.
Yeah, I took it off.
Perfect. Yeah, so you're meeting the mayor on the 20th, and part of the public consultation that you went to, clearly the mayor listened, and I know that you mentioned you got funding for the Cabot Square. You told that to me a few months ago. The issue of Cabot Square, when you presented at the public consultation on systemic racism and discrimination, the mayor was à l'écoute. She did listen to some of your concerns. Was that correct?
Well, I mean, I think she listened to media. I don't think she listened to my concerns. I think what happens is that, when I saw you at that particular consultation and we had the police that were sitting in front and we had Christopher Curtis who was there, and I only had like 10 minutes to share. So I had to shove it in, all the information. But the thing is that, in Cabot Square, about 8 Indigenous people died. And no one was doing anything about it, right? But when a dog froze to death on the street, that's when they created the Royal Victoria Hospital and had a shelter for the homeless at night. But when 8 people die, nobody does anything about it. And that's pretty much kind of my point, which kind of pushed them to do something. And when they did something, they said, we can give you $600,000 so that you can create something. And they presented that to sort of the Cabot Square committee, the security that we have with the city of Montreal. So there's about 25 different organizations that sit on that committee that work in that area, and nobody wanted to necessarily do anything. So I said, okay, I'll do something. I'm always that person that says, if nobody's going to do something, I will do something. So this is why with Resilience Montreal, I had to actually go and get more money because $600,000 was not going to do it. And also, I'm working with Sheila Woodhouse from Nazareth Community, and we are co-managing Resilience, but we are also going to be we're in the process now of getting it incorporated as its own organization and having bylaws, and then it'll have its own board of directors, and I can step back because I have a lot of work to do here at the shelter, but I'm not going to neglect the people at Cabot Square. So yes, it gives me much more work, but like, how do you let people just die? Like, I can't do it. I'm sorry.
So the question being, what are you going to present to the mayor? What are the priorities, and how are you going to keep them accountable? Because there were consultations. You mentioned the commissions, the Truth and Reconciliation, and never gets implemented. What are you going to do to ensure that the mayor actually implements what she's going to tell to you? Like, are you going to change your strategy? Like, what's the options there?
Sorry. The thing is that the reason why the mayor is inviting me to this meeting, she's inviting me and, Ghislaine Picard and Vivian Michel and a couple of the other chiefs from different communities, as we put in a press release and we sent an open letter. So for me, when I originally wrote the letter on May the 3rd, what I wanted was concrete police protocols that will change around responding to Indigenous mental health crisis. I wanted racial profiling against Indigenous women. I wanted an action plan on that. And I also wanted follow up on past police complaints, like what happened to Mina. Those are the 3 things I put forward. I have no idea what the chiefs have in mind. I don't know what the mayor is necessarily going to have to say about this. So I don't necessarily go in with high hopes. I think it's good to be invited. I mean, even with the action plan that you put forward, they said it's going to take a year. A year. Why is it going to take a year? If it's a priority and you're trying to find housing and you're trying to have, I mean, I know there was a lot of different scenarios that were put forward. I can't remember them all, but everything's taking a year. I'm like, no, it should take 2 months. If you can shut down the city and the world for COVID in a short period of time, you should be able to do this. You're supposed to be touting reconciliation and you're not proving it. So yeah, they're probably not going to want me to speak too much. They'll let the other chiefs talk, and I'll just be like grumbling in the corner with a smile. I don't know.
There's a question from Nicole to say, what could we do as individuals to help in terms of, are you looking for volunteers, also donations? Can you give us a little, inside look on that?
Yeah. So for Resilience Montreal, we need more volunteers and we need more donations. And the thing is that, I didn't talk at all about resilience so much, but the population that goes to Cabot Square are literally in the park now because we have to close Resilience Montreal because we couldn't social distance, but we didn't want to give up on the people.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone is in the park now, and we have at least 10 intervention workers in the park that are helping people in crisis. And with COVID, the people that are in the park have been there since March, in the cold, all night, all day. There's not enough housing, there's not enough rooms, there's no safe places. They used to be able to go into the metros or into the malls to keep warm. That has not been offered until recently, since they started opening some of the malls, or most of the malls. The metros are still not easy to get into. So it's really wearing on the population. So they are more sort of fed up. So the intervention workers are, you know, trying to help them, because even though the city is doing this like sort of deconfinement, so they're starting to close the services for the homeless, they're not putting anything in its place, right? So for instance, we serve 500 meals a day at Resilience. We serve breakfast and lunch and supper. But the other parks like MMIW, Place du Canada, and the one on the mountain, they finish at 1 o'clock, and they told us, you need to finish at 1 o'clock. And I'm like, no, everyone's getting supper. So they're like, well, if you give supper, it means that everyone's going to come down to Resilience. We're like, so at least they have supper, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a fight that we had to have with the city. So they said, yes, but you have to give them a cold supper. Fine. I'm like, really? Your food is too good? And our food is really good. And the reason why it's really good is because y'all are donating it, right? So we are doing burgers on the barbecue, and we're, you know, it's a little thing, but it means so much to them, right? And we just built showers because there's no place to take a shower, right? So now we have like 11 people who come in a day. We have a table at Cabot Square where people come for clothing and shoes and, you know, just everything that they could possibly need. We even give out sleeping bags and tents. But if they need a shower, they tell the intervention worker, we bring them over, we give them a shower. They have clean clothes and towels and, you know, soap and all that. And we asked the city 3 years ago for a shower in the area. They can't seem to do it. I'm like, fine, we'll build our own. But we can't really call it a shower. We call it a cooling station. You have to kind of get around the language. Otherwise, they're like, wait a minute, you're not allowed to have showers here. But it's on our property. So yeah, we can have showers. So, you know, but right now it's outside. So we need towels, right? We need clothing. We need summer clothing. We need more food. We need like on a day when like it's going to be really hot again. So if you can donate Gatorade or something like that. The people they're just fed up, and we still have to try to figure out what is our next step. If we move back into Resilience, we can only have a capacity of 50, which means that maybe, you know, 150 people will not have services. So are we going to have to work in the park partially and outside? Like we will do both. We will go over and above to help the people. So if you can find a way on how you can, you know, provide, you know, sometimes we make cookies and we just bring them out, you know, we fresh bake cookies. If you have cookies that you want, that you've made, you know, everything goes a long way. So even just like t-shirts or shorts or hoodies or flip-flops or shoes or whatever it is to give them some kind of comfort, they feel it, right? And this is the best that we can do until the city decides to help. So.
And that's amazing. And as you said that, you actually answered a few of the questions. One question was, many people have decluttered their homes. Do you take secondhand clean items? And from what you said, the answer is yes. I'll go one last question because I do want to stick to our time, you know, to have the hour. It's a big question, tough to answer, but you know, I'll just throw it out there. Do you see the possible change of the Canadian Constitution to change the status of Aboriginal people, to not be under the tutelage of the government, yet respect their culture, promote livelihood in their own communities? Do you see an amendment of the Canadian Constitution, you know, and is this something that you're working on? You know,
not me personally. You know, like what's hard about that question is that even if you change it, it doesn't mean people are going to apply it, right? You can change it if everyone chooses to ignore it. It's like all these reports that are out there, right? Even Gladue reports. Does anyone know what a Gladue report is? A lot of people don't. And the thing is that, you know, if I go to the courts and I did something like I robbed a bank, okay? I didn't rob a bank, but let's just say I robbed a bank and I'm at court. The lawyer is supposed to apply the Gladue reports, which means that it's in the law books or whatever you call it. My language is not great here, but the Gladue reports are supposed to look at your entire sort of colonial history as to why you might have robbed a bank. So if they ask me, what happened to you? Well, my mother went to residential school and then I, was adopted by a family that didn't like me so much. And then this happened and then that happened. And this is why, I felt like I needed to rob a bank. And then they can sentence according to the colonialism. The lawyers won't apply it. They won't do it. It's the law. They even have something called the appellate court. That means you have to do Gladue. But even in missing and murdered, it says apply the Gladue reports. The reason why they don't want to do it is because it's hard. It's very lengthy. So what do? Now our own native court workers are learning how to do the reports, and they are doing them because the lawyers won't. Then it's submitted, and then it changes the tone when they're being sentenced. The judge looks at it, he knows that that's a priority for him, and then he does it accordingly. So that's why it's hard. So, but we're still moving forward. So, nothing gets me down.
Yeah, and you're completely right. The criminal code was amended to put in the Gladue report, and yeah, it's not necessarily followed. Sentencing has not necessarily changed. Restorative justice has not necessarily been implemented. So yeah, I think that's a discussion for a whole other course. I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. It was very, very informative. A lot of people are asking how they could help and how they could support. We'll put your contact information and this course on montreal.org. You'll have all the contact information for Nakuset and the organizations. And you can, please donate and please volunteer. And if you have clothing or food or anything, every small step makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm telling you, the community has shown so much love for resilience. It's amazing. So I thank everyone who has helped, and anyone who wants to help, we'll take it happily.
Sounds great. So this course will be on montrealinaction.org. We're gonna put it there. And also if you follow us on Instagram, Montréal en Action, we'll put the link there. And if ever you want to contact Nakuset and volunteer or donate, I will also provide you with that information. Nakuset, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care.